What if everything you thought you knew about Jesus' ministry was only the surface? What if the miracles, the sermons, the healings were not the most important parts? What if the real message was hidden in the details? Almost no one noticed. This story begins with one man's obsession to find out. Daniel Carter had not slept in 3 days. Not because he was sick, not because he was grieving, but because of a single line he had found buried in a commentary on the Gospel of Luke. A line so simple it should not have stopped him cold, but it did. He read it again slowly, the way a man reads something that feels like it was written specifically for him. Jesus stopped reading before the passage was finished, and no one asked why. Daniel set the book down on his desk. Outside Nashville was alive with the ordinary sounds of a Tuesday afternoon traffic, a lawnmower 2 houses down, a neighbor's dog barking at something it could not reach. But inside that study, inside the mind of a 53-year-old former history professor who had spent 30 years teaching people how to ask better questions, something had cracked open. He pushed back from his desk and said out loud to no one in particular, "Why did he stop?" That was how it started. Not with a vision, not with a dramatic calling, just a man in a small office asking a question that refused to leave him alone. Daniel had come to faith late in life. He would be the first to tell you that. He had spent his academic career studying ancient civilizations, religious movements, and the power of narrative in shaping human culture. He had taught classes on early Christianity, the way a mechanic might teach someone to change a tire with precision, with competence, and with absolutely no personal investment in whether the car actually ran. Then his wife Margaret got sick, and the man who had answers for everything suddenly had none. He sat beside her hospital bed on a cold February night, holding her hand, and realized that every book he had ever read, every lecture he had ever given, every argument he had ever won, none of it could reach the place where he was standing. He was standing in the dark, and he had nothing to hold on to. Margaret recovered, slowly, incompletely, but she came back to him. And something in Daniel did not come back the same. He started reading the Gospels, not as a scholar, as a man who was desperate, and he discovered something that embarrassed him because he should have seen it sooner. He had studied Jesus as a historical figure for decades, but he had never actually listened to him. 3 years after Margaret's illness, Daniel was approached by a small production company based in Nashville. They were producing a documentary series for Easter, something that would go beyond the familiar stories, something that would reach people who had grown up in church but felt like they had stopped hearing anything new. The producer, a young woman named Claire, sat across from Daniel in a coffee shop and slid a list across the table. "We want to cover 10 facts about Jesus' ministry," she said. "Things most people miss, details that completely change how you understand who he was and what he was doing." Daniel looked at the list. He looked up at Claire. "You know," he said quietly, "most people who make documentaries about Jesus start with the miracles." "I know," she said. "We don't want to start there." "Where do you want to start?" She leaned forward. "We want to start with the question nobody asks." Daniel felt something move in his chest. He looked back down at the list. "All right," he said, "I'm in." What Daniel did not tell Claire What he did not tell anyone at first was that he had already been sitting with this question for months. Because here was the thing about studying Jesus' ministry. As a historian, the more carefully you looked, the more you realized that almost everything happened backwards from what you would expect. If you were going to launch the most significant movement in human history, you would not do it the way Jesus did it. You would not begin in Galilee. You would not choose fishermen. You would not spend your time in villages that powerful people could not find on a map. You would not have your longest conversation with a woman who had been rejected by her entire community. You would not touch the people that society had decided were too broken to touch. You would not stop reading a prophecy in the middle of the sentence. And yet, every single one of those choices turned out to matter more than anything a political strategist or a public relations expert could have designed. Daniel started making notes, pages and pages of notes. He covered his study walls with timelines and cross-references and questions. Margaret walked in one evening, looked at the walls, and said, "Daniel, how long has this been going on?" He turned around. He looked at her. Then he looked at the walls. "A while," he admitted. She walked in further, studying the notes he had pinned everywhere. She stopped at one piece of paper near the window. On it, he had written a single question in red marker. What was Jesus actually trying to show us? Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "That's the one, isn't it? That's the question underneath all the other questions." Daniel did not answer, but his silence told her everything. Chug. The research that followed was unlike anything Daniel had done in his academic career. Because this time, he was not studying a movement from the outside. He was standing inside it. He began with the opening of Jesus' public ministry, the moment in the synagogue in Nazareth, when Jesus stood up, took the scroll of Isaiah, and read. Luke 4:18 through 19. The passage about the Messiah coming to bring good news to the poor, to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free. And then Jesus closed the scroll, right there, mid-passage, before the next verse, which described the day of vengeance. Daniel sat with that for a long time. Because here is what most people don't realize. The people in that synagogue knew Isaiah. They had heard it their whole lives. They knew what came after verse 19. And when Jesus stopped where he stopped, every person in that room would have felt it. He was making a statement without saying a word. The era of mercy was here. The door was open. And he was telling them that before telling them anything else. Daniel wrote in his notebook. He announced the whole mission in one incomplete sentence. That was the first twist, and it hit Daniel like something physical. So he kept going. He moved through the Gospels slowly, carefully, the way you move through a house you've lived in for years, but are suddenly seeing with new eyes. He looked at the geography. Jesus began in Galilee, not Jerusalem. Why Jerusalem was the center of religious power. Jerusalem was where decisions were made, where the temple stood, where the important people were. Galilee was the provinces. It was the place that sophisticated people spoke about, with a slight curl of the lip. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? Even one of Jesus' own future disciples said that. Daniel leaned back in his chair and thought about all the times in his own life He had dismissed people because of where they came from. He thought about students he had underestimated. He thought about conversations he had ended too early. He thought about a God who deliberately chose to begin in the place that powerful people had written off. He wrote, "The kingdom didn't start in the center. It started in the margins." That was the second thing, and it was not just a historical observation. It was a rebuke and a comfort at the same time. The third thing came when Daniel started looking closely at the disciples. 12 men, 12. The number was not accidental. Any Jewish person of that era would have recognized immediately what 12 meant. 12 tribes of Israel, the full representation of God's people. By choosing exactly 12, Jesus was making an announcement that went beyond what he said out loud. He was saying, "I am rebuilding something, not reforming the current system, not improving the existing structure, rebuilding from the ground up." And look at who he chose. A fisherman who was impulsive and made mistakes constantly. A tax collector, someone who worked for the Roman occupiers, someone his own community would have considered a traitor. People from completely different backgrounds, with different tempers and different doubts and different histories. Daniel thought about the groups he had been part of over the years. Academic departments, faculty committees, church boards. How carefully everyone was chosen, how similar everyone ended up being. Jesus had done the opposite. Daniel wrote in his notebook, and his handwriting was more urgent now. He didn't choose the most qualified. He chose the most willing, and he made them a family. He sat back and stared at those words. And for a moment he was not a researcher sitting in a study in Nashville. He was a man who had felt for most of his life like he was standing just slightly outside the circle of people who were truly chosen for important things. And something in that sentence reached all the way down into that place. Claire called him that evening. "How's the research going?" she asked. Daniel was quiet for a second. "Claire," he said, "I don't think this is going to be a documentary about ancient history." "What do you mean?" "I mean, every fact I find, it's not just a fact. It's a mirror. It shows you something about yourself, about us, about the way we see people and the way we've been seen." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "That's exactly what we were hoping for," Claire said softly. Daniel looked at his notes spread across the desk. "There are 10 things I've found so far," he said, "and I haven't even gotten to the hardest ones yet." "What's the hardest one?" He picked up the piece of paper near the window, the one with the question in red marker. What was Jesus actually trying to show us? "I think the hardest one," Daniel said slowly, "is the answer to the question we've been too afraid to ask." He did not sleep that night. But this time, it was not because of anxiety. It was because every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same image, a man standing in a synagogue, closing a scroll at exactly the right place and watching people's faces change. The message was already in motion, and so was Daniel's. Daniel almost missed it entirely. I had been staring at the same page for 40 minutes, a commentary on the Gospel of Mark, chapter 1, when his phone buzzed. He ignored it. Then it buzzed again. He picked it up, saw it was his old colleague from Vanderbilt, Professor Raymond Holt, and almost set it back down. Almost. "Ray," he answered. "I heard you're working on something about Jesus' ministry," Raymond said, skipping any greeting. That was Raymond's way. Always had been. Historical analysis or the other kind? The other kind, Daniel said. A pause. Raymond Holt was one of the sharpest minds Daniel had ever known. He was also the most aggressively skeptical person in any room he ever entered. For him to call out of nowhere meant something. "I've been sitting on something for 2 years," Raymond said. "Something I found in a Galilean geography study that I never published. I think you need to see it." Daniel sat up straight. "What kind of something?" "The kind that changes the whole picture," Raymond said. "How soon can you meet Emma?" They met the next morning at a diner off Charlotte Pike, the kind of place where the coffee came in thick mugs and nobody bothered you. Raymond slid a folder across the table before Daniel had even sat down completely. "Look at the map," Raymond said. Daniel opened the folder. Inside was a detailed geographical analysis of first-century Galilee population centers, trade routes, synagogue locations, economic zones. "Tell me what you see," Raymond said. Daniel studied it. Galilee, mostly rural, agricultural, small fishing economy around the Sea of Galilee. He paused. Capernaum here. Nazareth here. He traced the distance with his finger. These towns are not close to each other. Keep going. The main trade routes don't run through any of the villages where Jesus spent most of his time. Daniel looked up. He avoided the trade routes. Raymond pointed at him. Exactly. He could have positioned himself where the traffic was, where the influence was, where the money moved. He didn't. And it wasn't accidental look at the timing of his movements between those villages. He was systematic. He had a pattern. Daniel looked back at the map, and the first thing that cracked open in him that morning was this: Jesus was not disorganized. He was not wandering. He had a strategy. And the strategy was the opposite of everything a person building influence would normally do. He was going to the people the world had stopped going to. Daniel closed the folder slowly. "Ray," he said, "do you believe any of this?" Raymond picked up his coffee mug. He was quiet for a long moment. "I believe the data," he finally said. "What the data means, that's your department." But Daniel saw something in Raymond's face that his old colleague would never say out loud. He saw a man who had been sitting with a question he did not have the courage to finish asking. Daniel understood that feeling very well. He drove home with Raymond's folder on the passenger seat and a thought circling in his mind that he could not shake. The pattern was undeniable. Jesus had moved through Galilee with purpose, small towns, overlooked communities, people who had been waiting for something without knowing what they were waiting for. And he had not just passed through, he had stayed. He had sat with people. He had eaten with them. He had learned their names. Daniel thought about a woman he had known years ago, a student in one of his history courses, a quiet girl who sat in the back row and almost never spoke. He had not called on her often. He had been honest enough with himself by now to admit why she did not seem like the kind of student who would have impressive things to say. She seemed ordinary. She went on to become one of the most respected biblical archaeologists of her generation. He had almost missed her entirely. And that thought sat in his chest like a stone, because that was exactly what the world had done with Galilee, and that was exactly what Jesus had refused to do. Back in his study, Daniel opened his Bible to Luke chapter 5 and read the calling of the first disciples again. He had read it dozens of times, but this time something jumped out that he had never fully felt before. Jesus did not walk up to Peter and say, "You are extraordinary. You are the most qualified person for this mission." He walked up to a man who was washing his nets after a night of catching nothing, a man who was tired and probably frustrated, and said, "Follow me." And Peter left everything. Daniel put the Bible down. He walked to the window. He stood there for a while, not looking at anything in particular, just thinking. What does it feel like to be chosen when you don't think you deserve to be chosen? I knew that feeling. He had felt it the day Margaret told him she still loved him, after he had been cold and distant for 2 years during the worst of his academic ambitions. He had felt it the day Claire called him for this documentary, when he was certain there were dozens of more qualified people she could have asked. And he thought about Peter on that shore, exhausted, empty-handed, and suddenly seen. He went back to his desk and wrote one sentence. The people Jesus called first were not successful. They were available. He underlined it twice. Then he sat back and stared at it, because that sentence was about Peter, but it was also about him. And he suspected it was about a great many people who would one day hear this story and feel something move in their chest without fully understanding why. The deeper Daniel went into the structure of the 12 disciples, the more unsettled he became in the best possible way. He had always understood intellectually that the number 12 was symbolic, but he had never sat long enough with what that symbolism actually meant in the moment Jesus chose it. This was not a subtle reference. This was a declaration. In first-century Jewish culture, the number 12 carried the weight of national identity, of covenant history, of God's original promise to Abraham. When Jesus assembled 12 specific individuals around himself, every person watching knew what he was saying. I was saying, this is not a reform, this is a restoration. Daniel picked up his phone and called Claire. "I need to add something to the outline," he said the moment she answered. "Good morning to you too, Daniel." "Sorry, good morning. I need to add something." "What did you find?" The 12 disciples. It wasn't just about having helpers. It was a public announcement. He was telling everyone who saw it that God was rebuilding his people from scratch, not fixing the broken system. Starting over. Claire was quiet for a second. Starting over with fishermen and tax collectors. "Exactly," Daniel said. "Which means..." He stopped. "Which means what?" He hesitated, because the conclusion he was about to say out loud felt almost too personal, too close. "Which means God has never once required the right credentials before starting something important. He required the right heart." The line was quiet. Then Claire said very softly, "Daniel, you need to say that on camera exactly the way you just said it." He almost laughed, but he was too shaken to laugh. Drawing. That afternoon, he called his daughter Hannah. She was 31, living in Atlanta, and going through the kind of season that makes a parent feel helpless, a painful divorce, a job. she had lost 3 months earlier, of faith. She told him she was not sure she still had. "Dad," she said when she answered, and he could tell immediately from her voice that it had been a hard day. "I know," he said. "I know. I just wanted to tell you something I found today. If this is Bible stuff, Dad, I'm not really—" "Just listen, 1 minute. Give me 1 minute." She sighed. "Okay." The first people Jesus chose were not people who had their lives together, he said. They were people who had just failed. Peter had fished all night and caught nothing. Matthew was working a job everybody hated him for. These were not the church's success stories. They were people in the middle of their hardest season. Hannah was quiet, and he walked up to them. Daniel continued, right there in the mess of it, and said, "I choose you, not after you get it together, right now." He heard her breath catch. 1 minute, she said, and he heard her moving like she was getting up, walking somewhere more private. "Just give me a minute." He waited. He heard her crying quietly on the other end of the line, trying not to let him hear it. And Daniel Carter, former history professor man, who had spent 30 years studying things with his head instead of his heart, sat in his study in Nashville and felt something break wide open in his chest. Because he had not called Hannah to help her. He had called her because the research had led him straight to her without him even realizing it. The kingdom had begun among the forgotten, and it had not stopped, not once, not in 2,000 years. He spent the rest of the evening going back over something he had noticed in his earlier notes, but had not yet fully unpacked the way Jesus taught. Not just what he taught, but the manner of it, the authority of it. Every Jewish teacher of that era had a method. They quoted other rabbis. They built arguments on the foundation of what previous scholars had said. They showed their sources. The legitimacy of your teaching was measured by how well you could connect it to those who came before you. Jesus did none of that. He stood up and said, "You have heard it said, but I say to you." Daniel felt the weight of that every time he read it. Not Rabbi Hillel said, not the tradition teaches. He spoke as if the authority originated with him, as if he was not passing along someone else's understanding of truth, but was in fact the source of it. And the people around him felt it immediately. Mark records it plainly. The crowds were amazed, because he taught as one who had authority, not as the teachers of the law. Daniel wrote in his notebook, he did not interpret the law. He inhabited it. He stared at that sentence. Then he added 3 words underneath, and it terrified people. Because it did. It thrilled some and terrified others often at the same time. And Daniel thought, sitting there alone, in his study long after midnight, the city quiet outside his window, that this was still exactly what happened when people truly encountered Jesus for the first time. Not the comfortable stained glass version, the real one. The one who looked at a crowd of ordinary, broken, overlooked people and said with the full weight of heaven behind his voice, "I came for you. I started here. I have always been starting here." And that was not ancient history. That was the most alive thing Daniel had touched in years. The call from Hannah came 3 days later. Daniel was in the middle of transcribing his notes when his phone lit up. He almost let it go to voicemail. He was deep inside something, a passage in Mark chapter 3, that had been pulling at him for 2 days. Something about the Sabbath healings that he could not quite articulate yet. But it was Hannah, so he picked up. "I've been thinking about what you said," she told him. No hello, no small talk, just straight into it the way she had always done, even as a little girl. About the disciples being chosen in the middle of their worst season. "Yeah," Daniel said carefully. "I went back and read it myself. Luke 5, the whole chapter." A pause. Dad Peter tells Jesus to go away from him. After the miracle. After Jesus fills his nets with more fish than he's ever seen in his life. Peter's first reaction is to say, "Depart from me, Lord, I am a sinful man." Daniel set his pen down. He thought being truly seen meant being rejected. Hannah continued, and her voice had that tight quality it got when she was holding something in. He thought if Jesus really knew him, Jesus wouldn't want him. The line was quiet for a moment. "And Jesus didn't leave," she finally said. "No," Daniel said. "He didn't." Another silence, longer this time. Then Hannah said, "Okay, keep going with your research, Dad. I think I need to hear the rest of it." Daniel sat with the phone in his hand long after she hung up. He thought about Peter on that boat, terrified not by the miracle, but by what the miracle revealed. That he was known, completely, fully known, and chosen anyway. He picked his pen back up. At the top of a fresh page, he wrote, "What if being truly seen is the thing we want most and fear most at the same time?" Then he turned back to Mark chapter 3. Because the next thing he had found was about to change everything. He thought he understood about what Jesus was willing to risk. It was a Sabbath day. A man with a withered hand was in the synagogue, and the Pharisees were watching. Mark makes it plain they were watching specifically to see if Jesus would heal on the Sabbath so they could accuse him. Daniel had read this scene 100 times, but this time he slowed down and sat inside it. Jesus knew they were watching. He knew the trap was set. He could have waited one day, one single day, and there would have been no controversy. The man's hand had been withered for years. One more day would not have mattered medically. Jesus could have healed him quietly, privately the next morning and avoided the confrontation entirely. Instead, he called the man to stand in front of everyone. Daniel wrote one word in his notebook and circled it 3 times. Intentional. This was not impulsive. This was not Jesus losing his temper or failing to read the political situation. He read it perfectly. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he did it anyway, publicly, deliberately, in front of the very people who were looking for a reason to destroy him. Daniel stood up from his desk. He needed to pace. He did that sometimes when something hit him too hard to sit still with. Because here was what most people missed completely. Jesus did not heal on the Sabbath in spite of the Sabbath. He healed on the Sabbath because of it. The Sabbath was God's gift of rest and restoration to his people, and a man with a withered hand, standing in God's house on God's holy day, surrounded by God's people, that man deserved to be restored, right there, right then. The Sabbath was not a legal technicality. It was a portrait of who God was. And Jesus was completing the portrait that the religious leaders had left unfinished. Daniel stopped pacing. He picked up his phone and texted Claire 4 words. "I need more time." She called him back in 60 seconds. "How much more time?" "I thought I understood the Sabbath healings," he said. "I didn't, not really." Claire, he wasn't breaking the Sabbath. He was defining it. I was showing people what the Sabbath was always supposed to mean: freedom, restoration, healing. And the people who were supposed to be teaching that truth had turned it into a fence that kept broken people out. Claire was quiet for a moment. Then, "Say that again." They turned God's gift of rest into a wall that kept broken people from reaching God. Daniel. Her voice had shifted. That's not just first-century history. That's happening right now. In churches right now. He had not thought about it that way, but the moment she said it, he knew she was right. And the weight of it settled over him like something physical. He sat back down. He had more to find. The fifth discovery hit him on a Wednesday afternoon, and it hit him in a way he had not prepared for. He had been reading through the accounts of Jesus healing lepers, not quickly, not academically, but slowly, word by word. The way you read a letter from someone who loves you. And he arrived at a moment in Mark chapter 1 that stopped his breath. A leper came to Jesus and said, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." Daniel read the next line 3 times. Jesus reached out his hand and touched him. He sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. In first-century Jewish culture, a leper was not simply sick. A leper was cut off from family, from community, from worship, from human contact. The law required lepers to call out, "Unclean, unclean," as they walked so that others could keep their distance. A leper had not felt another person's touch in years, possibly decades, and Jesus before. He said a single word before he healed him, before anything else, reached out and touched him. Daniel felt his throat tighten. He called Raymond. "I'm looking at the leper accounts," he said when Raymond picked up. And Raymond's voice was guarded in the way it always got when he sensed something significant was coming. He touched him first, Ray, before the healing. He didn't have to. He could have just spoken a word. He did that in other healings, but he touched him first. Raymond said nothing. "You know what that touch communicated," Daniel said. "Before any miracle happened, just the touch alone. It told that man you are not too contaminated for human contact. You are not beyond reach. You are still a person." Raymond cleared his throat. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. That's not a small thing." "It's not a small thing at all," Daniel said. "Ray?" He reversed the direction of contamination. In that culture, touching uncleanness made you unclean. But when Jesus touched that man, the uncleanness didn't spread to Jesus. The wholeness spread to the man. He flipped the whole system. Raymond was quiet for so long that Daniel thought the call had dropped. Then Raymond said slowly, "I need to think about that." Daniel recognized the tone. It was the tone Raymond Holt used when something had gotten past his defenses and reached him somewhere he had not expected to be reached. Daniel had heard it only twice before in 30 years of friendship. He let his old friend think. But the discovery that broke Daniel open the most, the one that made him set his notes down and sit in silence for a very long time, was the 6th one, and it was about the women. He had known as a historian that women played a role in Jesus' ministry. He had taught it as a cultural anomaly, an interesting sociological detail. He had never felt it. He felt it now. Women traveled with Jesus. Luke 8 names them directly: Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Susanna, and many others. They provided financial support for his mission. They were present at the cross, when almost every male disciple had fled. And when Jesus rose from the dead, the first people he appeared to were women. The first people commissioned to carry the news of the resurrection were women. Daniel thought about the culture those women lived inside. A culture where a woman's testimony was not considered legally valid. A culture where women were largely invisible in public religious life. A culture that had very clear, very firm ideas about whose voice mattered and whose did not. And Jesus deliberately and repeatedly gave women dignity, purpose, and a role at the center of the most important story in human history. Daniel thought about his mother, a woman who had raised 4 children mostly alone after his father left. A woman who had prayed over him every morning before school with a faith so steady and so deep that it had embarrassed him as a teenager and humbled him as an adult. A woman who had never been given a platform, never been told her faith was significant, never been recognized by any institution for anything. He pulled out his notebook. His handwriting was less careful, now more urgent, almost jagged. He wrote, "Jesus did not wait for culture to give women permission to matter. He gave it himself, underlined it." Then he sat back and thought about every woman he had known in his life, whose voice had been dismissed, whose faith had been minimized, whose contribution had been overlooked. His mother, Margaret, during those years when he had been too distracted by his career to listen to her. Hannah, being told by people in her church community during her divorce that she should be quieter about her pain. The list was longer than he wanted it to be, and Jesus had walked straight into the middle of a culture that ignored women and said with his choices and his actions and the way he looked at people, "No, that is not how my Father sees them." Daniel closed his notebook. He sat in the quiet of his study and felt something shifting inside him, not like an idea forming, but like something old and calcified, finally beginning to loosen. He had started this project as a researcher, trying to find interesting historical details for a documentary. But the details kept finding him instead, and every single one of them carried the same message underneath it, the same truth that kept surfacing. No matter which direction he looked, Jesus was not cautious with his compassion. He did not calculate the political cost before he touched someone who was broken. He did not wait to see whether the crowd approved before he restored someone who had been cast aside. He did not choose his moments based on what would be safest or most strategic. He moved toward broken people the way water moves toward the lowest place, naturally, without hesitation, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. And Daniel, who had spent a lifetime being careful and measured and strategic about nearly everything, felt that truth land somewhere deep inside him and stay there. He had found 4 more facts still to uncover, but he already knew sitting there in the silence that nothing he found next would be able to undo what these 3 days had already done to him. Some doors once opened cannot be closed again, and Daniel Carter had walked through one of them. Margaret found him asleep at his desk at 2 in the morning. She did not wake him right away. She stood in the doorway of his study and looked at him, head resting on his folded arms, his Bible open beside him. 3 notebooks filled with his handwriting spread across every available surface. She looked at the man she had been married to for 29 years and saw something in his face she had not seen in a long time. Even in sleep, he looked like a man who had been cracked open and was still trying to figure out what had gotten in. She put a blanket over his shoulders and left him there. When he woke at 5:30, stiff and disoriented, the first thing he saw was a cup of coffee sitting next to his Bible, still warm. He picked it up and held it with both hands and sat there in the early morning quiet, and he thought about parables, because that was where his notes had led him the night before, right before exhaustion had pulled him under. The seventh fact. And it was the one that had kept him awake the longest before. Sleep finally won. Everyone knew Jesus told parables. Sunday school knew that. But what Daniel had discovered, and what had unsettled him so completely that he had filled an entire notebook trying to work through it, was the reason Jesus gave for telling them. It was not the reason most people assumed. Daniel had been reading Matthew 13 when he found it. The disciples came to Jesus privately and asked him directly, "Why do you speak to the people in parables?" And Jesus answered them. He answered them clearly. He said that the parables were designed so that those who were truly searching would find deeper truth, and those who refused to see would only hear a story. Daniel had read that passage many times, but this time a single phrase had stopped him completely. He had always assumed the parables were Jesus making difficult truth simple, making it accessible, bringing it down to a level ordinary people could understand. And that was part of it, but it was not all of it, because Jesus himself said the parables functioned as a kind of filter. They revealed the condition of the person hearing them. The same story told to two different people could produce two completely different responses, not because the story changed, but because the hearts of the listeners were different. A parable was not just a teaching tool. It was a mirror. Daniel had written that in his notebook and stared at it for a long time. Then he had written underneath it, "The story doesn't tell you about God. It tells you about yourself." He picked up his phone and called Claire before 7 in the morning, which he knew she would forgive him for, because she had specifically told him to call the moment he found something important. "The parables," he said when she answered, her voice still thick with sleep. "Daniel, it is 6:47. The parables were mirrors, Claire. That's what he said himself. They didn't just teach truth. They exposed where you were with truth. The same story hit different people completely differently, based on what was already in their heart." A long pause. He heard her sitting up. "So when the prodigal son's older brother gets angry," she said slowly, "and you find yourself agreeing with him, the parable just showed you something about yourself," Daniel finished. "Yes, exactly." Another silence. Then Claire said very quietly, "I've always agreed with the older brother." "So have I," Daniel said. "That's the point." He spent that morning going through the parables one by one, not reading them, but sitting inside them the way you sit inside a room you have lived in for years and suddenly notice that the walls are actually a different color than you always thought. The prodigal son, the good Samaritan, the lost sheep, the unforgiving servant, the workers in the vineyard. And in each one he kept finding the same hidden structure, a moment where the listener was quietly, gently, and completely, undeniably invited to see themselves. The workers in the vineyard hit him the hardest. Workers hired at the beginning of the day received the same wage as workers hired an hour before quitting time. And the ones who had worked all day were furious, rightfully furious by every human standard of fairness. And Jesus did not argue with their logic. He just asked one question: "Are you envious because I am generous?" Daniel sat with that question for a very long time, because he recognized it. He recognized the feeling of believing you deserved more because you had worked harder, waited longer, sacrificed more than the person standing next to you, who seemed to receive the same grace with a fraction of the effort. He had felt that in academic circles. He had felt it in his marriage during the hard years. If he was being fully honest, he had felt it in his faith, a subtle, deeply buried sense that people who came to God late in life or after dramatic failures somehow got the same welcome as people who had been faithful their whole lives, and that this was not entirely fair. The parable looked right at him and said, "That is exactly the attitude I am talking about." He almost laughed. It was not comfortable, but it was clean. And he understood for the first time why Jesus told stories instead of arguments. Because an argument puts you on the defensive. A story gets inside you before your defenses go up. And by the time you realize what happened, the truth is already there. He wrote, Jesus told parables because the human heart will argue with doctrine, but it cannot help responding to a story. Raymond called him that afternoon, and Daniel could tell immediately that something had changed in his old friend's voice. It was steadier, more deliberate, like a man choosing his words more carefully than usual because he was not entirely sure where they were going to take him. "I've been reading," Raymond said. "Good reading or difficult reading, both." A pause. "I've been looking at the geography of Jesus's ministry again. Not just the map, the actual towns, the actual populations. Daniel, do you know how much time Jesus spent in small towns versus the major centers? Tell me." The overwhelming majority of his documented ministry happened in towns that modern historians barely reference. Not just Galilee and general specific villages. Chorazin, Bethsaida, small places, places that mattered to nobody with power. Raymond's voice had an edge to it now, not his usual skeptical edge, but something rawer. He could have been in Jerusalem. He kept choosing not to be. Daniel thought about the eighth fact he had been circling for days. He wasn't building from the top down, he said. No, Raymond agreed. He was building from the ground up, starting with people who had nothing to offer him politically, no influence, no platform, no connections. Which means, Daniel said, the kingdom he was building was not the kind that could be measured by any of the metrics we normally use to measure success. Raymond was quiet for a moment. "That's uncomfortable," he finally said. "Yes," Daniel said. "It is." Another pause. Longer. Then Raymond said something that Daniel had never heard him say in 30 years. "I think I've been measuring wrong things for a very long time." Daniel did not push it. He just let it sit there, because he understood that some realizations need air. They need someone who will not immediately try to fix them or resolve them or turn them into a 3-step program. They just need to be spoken into the presence of another person who is willing to take them seriously. He was learning that from Jesus, too. The 9th fact was the one that brought Daniel to his knees, literally. He was reading John chapter 4 on a Thursday evening, the account of the Samaritan woman at the well, and he had to stop halfway through and get up from his desk and kneel on the floor of his study. Not because he planned to. His legs just took him there. He had known this story his entire adult life, but he had never once stopped to register the single most extraordinary detail sitting right at the surface of it. Jesus' longest recorded conversation in any of the 4 Gospels was not with a Pharisee, not with a scribe, not with a Roman official or a wealthy patron or a religious leader or any of the people a movement builder would have targeted as strategic relationships. It was not even with one of his own disciples. It was with a Samaritan woman, at a well, in the middle of the day, and every single word of that context was a signal. Samaritans were despised by mainstream Jewish culture, a deep historical mutual contempt that went back centuries. Women were not engaged in extended public theological conversation by Jewish teachers. And the middle of the day was when a woman drew water alone, because the other women came in the cool of the morning and evening. She was there at midday for the same reason people do things they don't want witnesses to. She was avoiding company. She was hiding. And Jesus was sitting at the well waiting, not passing through, not pausing briefly on his way somewhere more important, waiting. Daniel pressed his forehead against his hands on the floor of his study and stayed there, because the weight of what that meant was more than he could hold sitting upright. Jesus had sent his disciples into town to get food. He was alone, and he initiated a conversation with a woman, a Samaritan woman, a woman whose personal history he was about to demonstrate. He already knew, and he did not begin with her failures. He began with thirst. He began with something she needed. He asked her for water first. He made himself the one in need before he revealed that he was the one with everything to give. Daniel thought about every person in his life who had come to him broken, and how often his first instinct had been to position himself as the one with answers, the expert, the professor, the man who had read the right books. Jesus had sat down with the most marginalized person in the region and started the conversation as if he needed something from her. And by the end of that conversation, she had left her water jar at the well and run back to her city and said to everyone who had rejected her for years, Come and see a man who told me everything I ever did." And they came, because of her. The woman who had been hiding at a midday well became the first evangelist of her community. Daniel got up off the floor slowly. He sat back in his chair. He looked at his notes. His hands were not entirely steady. He picked up his phone and called Hannah. She answered on the second ring. "Dad, I need to tell you about a woman," he said. "A woman who thought she was too broken to be used for anything important." Hannah did not say anything, but she did not hang up either. She had failed, Daniel said, multiple times publicly. Her community knew everything about her worst moments. She was not going to win any awards for her history. And Jesus sat down with her and had the longest conversation he ever had with anyone we have recorded. And at the end of it, she changed her whole city. He heard Hannah breathing. Her past did not disqualify her, he said. It was actually part of the story, because when she told her neighbors, "Come and see a man who told me everything I ever did," they listened to her because they knew she wasn't exaggerating. They knew her history, and her history was exactly what made her testimony credible. The silence on the line stretched out. Then Hannah said in a voice barely above a whisper, "Her worst thing became her most powerful thing." "Yes," Daniel said. "Exactly, yes." He heard her take a long, unsteady breath. "Okay, Dad," she said. "Okay." He did not ask her what she meant by okay. He did not need to. He had been her father for 31 years. He knew what that particular okay meant. It meant something just moved in me, something I did not expect. Daniel sat quietly after the call ended, his hand still resting on his phone. Outside, Nashville was settling into its evening, and inside his study, surrounded by 3 weeks of research and notes and questions and discoveries, he felt the answer to his original question taking shape. What was Jesus actually trying to show us? He picked up his pen. He looked at the question he had written in red marker on the paper near the window, the one Margaret had found weeks ago. And beneath it, in the same red marker, he finally began to write the answer. He wrote slowly, deliberately, the way you write something you have been waiting your whole life to say. He wrote for 2 hours without stopping. The red marker moved across page after page, not notes anymore, not research fragments, but something that felt closer to a confession. Daniel Carter, the man who had spent 30 years teaching other people how to analyze history from a safe academic distance, was writing from somewhere he had never written from before. Somewhere without armor. Margaret knocked on the door at 9 o'clock and opened it without waiting for an answer. She looked at the pages spread across the desk. She looked at him. She had known him long enough to recognize the difference between a man doing work and a man being undone by something he could not control. "Daniel," she said quietly. "What happened?" He looked up. His eyes were red not from crying exactly, but from the particular strain of holding something very large inside a very small space for too long. "I found the answer," he said. She walked in and sat across from him. "Tell me." He picked up the paper near the window, the one with the question in red. What was Jesus actually trying to show us, and beneath it what he had written over the last 2 hours? He read it to her, all of it. When he finished, the room was very quiet. Margaret sat with her hands folded in her lap, looking at him the way she had looked at him across a hospital room 5 years ago, with the kind of steadiness that only comes from having walked through fire with someone and come out the other side, still holding their hand. "Read me the last part again," she said. Daniel looked down at the page. His voice was not entirely steady. "God was not showing the world a system," he read. "He was showing the world himself. And the self he showed looked nothing like what power expected. It moved toward broken people. It stopped for the ones everyone else walked past. It chose the overlooked, the outcast, the failed, and the forgotten. Not despite who they were, but because of exactly who they were. Because that is where love goes when it is completely free to choose." Margaret reached across the desk and put her hand over his. Neither of them said anything for a long time. Chug. The recording sessions began the following Monday. Claire had set up a simple space, just a chair, a camera, and good light. Nothing elaborate. She had been deliberate about that. She told Daniel the morning they started, "I don't want anything in the frame that competes with what you're saying, just you and the truth." Daniel had nodded. But sitting in that chair for the first time facing the camera, he felt something he had not felt in decades. He felt nervous. Not the professional nervousness of a man about to give a lecture he had given 100 times. The deeper kind. The kind that comes when you are about to say something real in front of people you cannot see. Claire stood behind the camera. "Whenever you're ready," she said. He took a breath. He looked directly into the lens, and he began. He started where the research had started with the synagogue in Nazareth, with a man standing before people who had known him since childhood, unrolling a scroll and reading a passage everyone in the room knew by heart, and stopping in the middle of it. He stopped reading, Daniel said to the camera, right before the verse about judgment, and every person in that room would have felt the absence of that verse like a missed heartbeat, because they knew what came next. They had grown up with it. And he stopped, right there. He leaned forward slightly. That incomplete sentence was the whole announcement. The era of mercy was open. The door was not closed. And he was telling them before he told them anything else, come. There is still time. Come. Claire said nothing. The camera kept rolling. They recorded for 4 days, and each day something unexpected happened. On the second day, Claire stopped the recording mid-session and asked Daniel to wait. She walked out of the room without explaining why. She came back 5 minutes later with her own eyes visibly red. "I'm sorry," she said. "I needed a minute." "Which part?" Daniel asked. She shook her head. "The part about the leper, about Jesus touching him before he healed him." She pressed her lips together. "My mother has been sick for 2 years, and I have been so focused on praying for her healing that I think I forgot to just sit with her, just be present with her, without fixing anything." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. "That's what he was showing us," he said quietly. "That's exactly what he was showing us." Claire nodded once quickly, the way people nod when they are trying to hold themselves together. Then she picked up her clipboard and said, "Okay, let's keep going." But Daniel had seen it. The research was not staying inside the documentary. It was moving through people like water moving through dry ground. Every person who came into contact with it was being reached in a different place, by a different fact, in a way that had nothing to do with Daniel's expertise, and everything to do with something working underneath the surface of the story. I thought about the Samaritan woman's community, how they came to faith, not because of sophisticated theology, but because a woman they all knew with a history. They all knew said simply, "Come and see." And they came. He felt the weight of that in a new way. On the third day of recording, Raymond showed up. He had not called ahead. He simply appeared in the doorway of the recording space in the middle of the afternoon, hands in his pockets, looking like a man who had driven across town to do something before he could talk himself out of it. Claire saw him first. She looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at Raymond. "I'm not interrupting," Raymond said. It was not quite a question. "You're not interrupting," Daniel said. "Come in." Raymond sat in a chair against the wall. He watched Daniel record the next segment, the one about the parables being mirrors about the workers in the vineyard, about the way Jesus told stories that got inside people before their defenses could stop them. When Claire called a break, Raymond stood up and walked over to Daniel. He stood there for a moment with his arms crossed, looking at the floor. "I need to tell you something," Raymond said. "Okay. I went to church Sunday." He said it the way a man confesses something he is not sure will be well received. "First time, and it's been a long time, Daniel." Daniel did not say anything. He waited. "I sat in the back," Raymond continued. "I didn't talk to anyone. I just sat there. And the pastor read from John 4, the woman at the well." He looked up. "And I thought about what you said, about Jesus waiting for her, deliberately, already there when she arrived." He stopped, looked back at the floor. "I've spent my entire career arguing that faith is intellectually indefensible," Raymond said. "I've been very good at that argument. I've made it in classrooms and in papers and in conversations with colleagues, and I have always felt like I was the smartest person in that particular debate." He paused. "And I sat in that church on Sunday and realized I had been winning an argument I was terrified to lose. Because if I lost it—" He stopped again, swallowed. "If I lost it, it meant that someone had been waiting for me, and I had no idea what to do with that." The recording space was completely silent. Daniel stood up from his chair. He crossed the room and put his hand on his old friend's shoulder. He did not offer a theological response. He did not cite a source. He just stood there with Raymond the way Jesus had stood with people throughout 30 years of his research, present without agenda, without rushing toward resolution. Raymond cleared his throat. "Don't make a big deal out of this," he said gruffly. "I'm not making anything," Daniel said. "Good." Raymond straightened up, uncrossed his arms, looked at the camera setup. "Your lighting is wrong, by the way. That shadow is going to bother people." Daniel almost laughed. "Good to have you back, Ray." The final recording session was the 10th fact, and Daniel had saved it intentionally for last, because it was the one the whole story circled back to, the one that had started everything. Jesus in the synagogue, the scroll of Isaiah, the words about freedom and healing and restoration, and the deliberate, meaningful, world-altering stopping before the verse of judgment. Daniel looked into the camera one last time. "Here is what I think he was doing," he said. "And I want you to hear this not as a historical observation, but as something meant for you personally right now, wherever you are." He leaned forward. He stopped reading because the rest of the passage was not yet the point. The point, the whole point, the entire reason. He was standing in that synagogue on that day in front of people who would eventually reject him, was mercy. The door was open. The time of grace had come, and he wanted that to be the first thing anyone heard from him. Not warning, not judgment, not a list of requirements. Mercy first. Always mercy first. He paused. Let that settle. 2,000 years later, that door is still the same door, the passage. He stopped reading. He stopped it for every person who would come after. For the woman who thinks she has failed too many times. For the man who has been so far from God for so long that he cannot imagine the distance being crossable. For the person sitting alone tonight, who is convinced that their particular kind of broken is the kind that doesn't get fixed. His voice did not break, but it came close. He started among forgotten people. He touched the ones no one else would touch. He had his longest conversation with the woman everyone had given up on. He chose fishermen and failures and outsiders and gave them the most important work in history. He healed people on the day that was supposed to be about rest, because rest was always supposed to mean freedom, and he refused to let a rule stand between a suffering person and their healing. He took a breath. Every single detail of his ministry was saying the same thing in a different way. The message was always the same underneath. You are not too far. You are not too broken. You are not too small. And I have not finished with you yet. He sat back. That was the ministry of Jesus, not just miracles, not just ancient history. A God who moves toward broken people like water moves toward the lowest place naturally, without hesitation, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. He looked directly into the camera, directly at the person on the other side of it. The question that started this whole journey was simple. What if the most important parts of Jesus' ministry were the details almost everyone missed? And the answer turned out to be even simpler than the question. He paused one final time. The detail everyone missed was never a historical footnote. It was an invitation, and it has your name on it. Claire called cut. Nobody in the room spoke, and Daniel Carter sat in that chair for a long moment in the silence that follows something true and felt. For the first time in a long time, maybe for the first time ever, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The scroll had been opened, the words had been spoken, and the door, as it had always been, was still wide open. That was not the end of the story. That was only where it was finally allowed to begin.